Dog refuses to leave a grave. When the police opened the grave, they were paralyzed with fear. The cold wind howled through the cemetery, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the faint aroma of flowers left to wither. The mourners stood in solemn silence, their black-clad figures casting long shadows over the freshly dug grave. Tears streamed down the faces of some, while others looked on with stoic expressions, their grief buried as deep as the coffin that was about to be lowered into the ground. But amidst the sea of human sorrow, one figure stood out: a dog. The dog, a scruffy brown mutt with intelligent amber eyes, had been pacing around the edge of the grave for hours. His fur was matted with mud from the relentless rain, but he paid no heed to the weather. His focus was unwavering, fixed on the dark wooden coffin that lay at the center of it all. Every time someone approached the coffin, the dog growled a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down the spine. "Whose dog is that?" whispered one mourner, a middle-aged woman clutching a handkerchief to her face. "No one knows," replied another. "It just showed up this morning and hasn't left since." The priest, an elderly man with a trembling hand holding his prayer book, cleared his throat nervously. "Shall we proceed?" he asked, his voice betraying his unease. But as the pallbearers moved to lower the coffin, the dog's behavior changed. He barked loud, sharp, and frantic. He darted toward the coffin, his nails scraping against the wood as if trying to claw it open. The crowd gasped in shock. "Get that dog out of here!" shouted a man from the back. A young boy, no older than 10, stepped forward hesitantly. "Wait. Maybe he's trying to tell us something," he said, his voice quivering with a mix of fear and curiosity. The dog turned to the boy, his amber eyes locking onto his with an almost human intensity. The boy froze, his heart pounding as an unspoken understanding passed between them. "Tommy, come back here," his mother called, dragging him away. As if on cue, the dog began to whimper, his ears flattening against his head. He lay down beside the grave, his body pressed against the damp soil as though refusing to let go. The mourners whispered among themselves, their unease growing. "Maybe the dog belonged to the deceased," someone suggested. "Then why is he acting like this?" another countered. The priest cleared his throat again, louder this time. "Enough. We must proceed." But as the coffin began its descent into the grave, the dog let out a blood-curdling howl, a sound so haunting it seemed to pierce through the fog-covered cemetery. Several people shivered involuntarily, their nerves already on edge. "What's gotten into him?" someone muttered, their voice barely audible. The dog leapt to his feet, barking furiously. His gaze darted between the mourners and the coffin, as if pleading for someone to understand. A man in a police uniform, who had been standing on the periphery of the crowd, stepped forward. Officer Ryan was a seasoned investigator, not easily swayed by superstition or emotion. Yet even he felt a knot of unease in his stomach as he observed the dog's behavior. "Wait," Ryan said, holding up a hand. "Something isn't right here." The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on the officer. Ryan crouched down, extending a hand toward the dog. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "What's going on here? Show me." The dog stopped barking, his head tilting slightly as if considering the officer's words. Then, without warning, he bounded toward the coffin, his claws scraping against its polished surface once more. Ryan frowned. He'd seen animals react to grief before, but this was different. It was as though the dog knew something that no one else did. "Open it," Ryan said suddenly, his voice firm. The crowd erupted into murmurs of protest. "Are you out of your mind?" a woman exclaimed. "You can't desecrate the dead," cried another. Ryan held up a hand to silence them. "I understand your concerns, but I can't ignore this. There's something strange going on, and we need to find out what it is." The priest hesitated, clutching his prayer book tightly. "Officer, I must protest." "I'll take full responsibility," Ryan interrupted. "Now, step back." The crowd parted reluctantly as Ryan called over 2 cemetery workers to assist. The atmosphere was tense, the air heavy with anticipation and fear. The dog sat beside Ryan, his tail wagging ever so slightly as if sensing that someone was finally listening. As the lid of the coffin was pried open, the dog let out a low growl, his hackles raised. And then, silence. What they saw inside the coffin left everyone paralyzed with fear. What could possibly be inside the coffin to cause such terror? Why was the dog so desperate to reveal the truth? Stay with us as we unravel the chilling mystery behind this graveyard enigma. What do you think the dog knew all along? The tension was suffocating as the mourners stood frozen, their eyes locked on the open coffin. Inside lay the body of an elderly man, pale and still, as one would expect of someone recently deceased. But it wasn't the corpse that caused gasps to ripple through the crowd. The body was clutching something, an object that didn't belong. A small, blood-stained doll rested in the man's hands, its glassy eyes staring blankly upward. The doll's crimson-streaked dress contrasted starkly against the muted colors of death. Officer Ryan leaned closer, his brow furrowing. The doll looked old, its fabric worn and its painted face cracked. But it wasn't just the appearance of the doll that unnerved him. It was the question gnawing at his mind: why was this here? Before anyone could voice their confusion, the dog barked sharply, as if to urge them onward. "Step back," Ryan ordered, waving the crowd away. He reached into the coffin with gloved hands, carefully prying the doll from the corpse's grip. The dog watched intently, its tail wagging once in approval. "Officer, this is madness," the priest whispered, his voice trembling. "We shouldn't disturb the dead." "And yet here we are," Ryan replied, his eyes never leaving the doll. Suddenly, the dog darted away, weaving through the crowd with a renewed sense of urgency. He stopped at the far edge of the cemetery, near a weathered mausoleum. His barks echoed through the fog, loud and insistent. "Looks like he wants us to follow," Ryan muttered. Tommy, the young boy, broke free from his mother's grasp and ran after the dog. "Wait," his mother called, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of the dog's barking. Ryan turned to the cemetery workers. "Close the coffin for now. We'll figure this out later." As the group followed the dog, the crowd hung back, murmuring anxiously among themselves. The path to the mausoleum was overgrown with weeds, and the air seemed colder here, as though the shadows themselves carried a chill. The dog stopped in front of the rusted iron gate, pawing at the ground. Tommy knelt beside him, brushing away the dirt to reveal something buried beneath. "What is it, boy?" Ryan asked as he approached. Tommy pulled out a small, tarnished locket, his hands trembling as he held it up to the light. Inside was a faded photograph of a young girl, her face eerily familiar. The priest, who had reluctantly followed the group, gasped. That's Margaret," he whispered. "Who's Margaret?" Ryan asked, his tone sharp. She went missing years ago," the priest stammered. "She was just a child. Her case was never solved." The dog barked again, his tail wagging furiously as he sniffed the ground. Ryan's stomach churned. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they painted was far from comforting. "Did the deceased, Mr. Harold, know Margaret?" Ryan asked, gesturing toward the coffin in the distance. The priest hesitated before nodding. Harold was her uncle. But he always claimed to have no idea what happened to her. The police questioned him back then, but there was no evidence. Ryan's jaw tightened. Until now. The cemetery workers, still uneasy from the coffin incident, approached the mausoleum at Ryan's request. Armed with shovels and flashlights, they began digging where the dog continued to paw. The crowd watched from a distance, their whispers growing louder with each passing minute. "I don't like this," one of the workers muttered. "It feels wrong." "Keep digging," Ryan instructed, his voice firm. Finally, the shovel hit something solid. The workers exchanged nervous glances before clearing away the remaining dirt. What they uncovered was a small wooden box, its surface cracked and weathered with age. Ryan knelt beside it, his heart pounding as he lifted the lid. Inside were more dolls, each one eerily similar to the first. Their dresses were stained, their faces marred, and their tiny hands clutching locks of hair. The crowd recoiled in horror. This can't be real," someone whispered. But the dog remained calm, sitting beside Ryan as if to assure him that the worst was yet to come. Ryan carefully removed one of the dolls, inspecting it closely. These look handmade, he said, his voice low. Each one represents a child, doesn't it? The priest crossed himself, his face pale. Margaret, she loved dolls. She used to make them with her friends. Do you recognize any of these other children? Ryan asked, holding up another doll. The priest hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes. That's Emily. She disappeared the same year as Margaret. The air grew heavier, the weight of the discovery pressing down on everyone present. Ryan stood, clutching the doll tightly. We need to call forensics, he said. But before he could reach for his radio, the dog barked again, this time running toward the woods beyond the cemetery. Where are you going now? Ryan muttered, running after him. Tommy followed, his small legs struggling to keep up. Tommy, stay back. Ryan shouted, but the boy was determined. The woods were dense and shadowy, the branches twisting overhead like skeletal fingers. The dog navigated the terrain effortlessly, stopping occasionally to bark and ensure Ryan was following. Finally, they emerged into a clearing. At its center stood an abandoned cabin, its windows shattered and its roof sagging. The dog barked furiously, circling the front door. Ryan's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he couldn't ignore the sense of purpose in the dog's behavior. Stay here, he told Tommy, who nodded reluctantly. With his flashlight in one hand and his other resting on the gun at his hip, Ryan approached the cabin. The door creaked open with a push, revealing a scene that made his blood run cold. The room was filled with more dolls, each one displayed on shelves or hanging from the ceiling. The walls were covered in faded photographs of children, their smiling faces a stark contrast to the macabre display around them. And then he saw it, a journal lying open on a table, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting. Ryan's hands trembled as he flipped through it, his breath catching in his throat. Each entry detailed the disappearance of a child, describing their habits, their favorite places to play, and ultimately, their fate. The last entry read, Margaret cried the loudest, but she was the prettiest. She'll stay with me forever. The dog growled low in his throat, his body tense as he stood at Ryan's side. Who wrote the journal? And what dark secrets does the cabin hold? Stay tuned as the mystery deepens and the truth becomes more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The cold wind howled through the broken windows of the cabin, carrying with it a sense of dread that settled deep into Ryan's chest. The dog growled softly, its eyes fixed on the corner of the room. Something was there, something hidden in the shadows. Ryan tightened his grip on the flashlight, its beam quivering as it scanned the room. The dolls hanging from the ceiling swayed ominously, their glassy eyes reflecting the light in ghostly pinpoints. The air smelled of mildew, dust, and something faintly metallic. Show yourself! Ryan called, his voice breaking the eerie silence. The response was immediate. A faint creak echoed from the shadows, followed by the unmistakable sound of breathing. Ryan's hand instinctively moved to his holster as he edged closer. The dog stood firm at his side, its body low and tense, ready to pounce. The beam of light landed on a figure crouched in the corner, shrouded in darkness. As Ryan stepped closer, the figure straightened, revealing a gaunt, disheveled man. His sunken eyes glinted with an unnatural intensity, and his wiry frame seemed to shake with suppressed emotion. What are you doing here? Ryan demanded, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his gut. The man tilted his head, a twisted smile spreading across his face. Protecting them, he whispered. Ryan's eyes flicked to the journal on the table, then back to the man. You wrote this, he said, holding it up. You were the one who. They're safe now, the man interrupted, his tone eerily calm. Away from the world. Away from the pain. The dog barked sharply, its teeth bared. The man flinched but quickly regained his composure. You don't understand, he hissed, his voice rising. Harold was the monster. He took her, took Margaret and the others. I found them. I saved them. Ryan's mind raced. Was this man confessing to murder, or was he exposing an even darker truth? Why the dolls? Ryan asked, his voice firm but low. Why bury them? The man's eyes darted to the shelves, his expression softening. To remember them.
To honor them. Harold didn't just kill them, he took their innocence, their joy. I couldn't let them be forgotten. Ryan felt a wave of nausea. If what this man was saying was true, the crime went far deeper than anyone had imagined. You could have gone to the police, Ryan said, trying to keep him talking. The man laughed bitterly. And let Harold charm his way out of it? He was a respected man, a pillar of the community. No one would have believed me. They would have locked me away while he continued. His voice broke, and he covered his face with trembling hands. Ryan took a step forward. Where are the bodies? The man's hands dropped, his eyes blazing with desperation. You don't need to find them. Let them rest. Harold is dead, that's justice enough, isn't it? The dog barked again, pacing toward a trapdoor in the floor. Its claws scraped against the wooden planks as it scratched furiously. No, the man screamed, lunging toward the dog. Ryan moved swiftly, drawing his weapon. Stay back, he ordered. The man froze, his chest heaving. Don't open it, he pleaded. Please. You don't want to see. Ignoring the man's protests, Ryan knelt beside the trapdoor, his hand hovering over the rusty latch. The dog whined softly, nudging his arm as if urging him onward. With a deep breath, Ryan yanked the trapdoor open. A foul stench rose from the darkness below, so potent it made his eyes water. He shone his flashlight into the hole, revealing a crude staircase leading down into a makeshift cellar. What's down there? Ryan asked, his voice sharp. The man didn't respond. He sank to the floor, rocking back and forth as tears streamed down his face. Ryan descended the stairs cautiously, the dog following close behind. The cellar was small and damp, the walls lined with shelves that held more dolls, each one more grotesque than the last. But it wasn't the dolls that made Ryan's heart stop. In the far corner of the cellar lay a pile of tiny bones, partially covered by dirt and tattered fabric. Some still had remnants of clothing clinging to them, faded and torn. Ryan's legs nearly gave out. He gripped the flashlight tightly, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The dog stood silently beside him, its head bowed as if mourning the children whose remains lay before them. What happened here? Ryan whispered, though he wasn't sure if he wanted an answer. A faint sound from above drew his attention. He turned to see the man standing at the top of the stairs, his face blank and his eyes distant. I tried to give them peace, the man said softly. But their cries. I hear them every night. I hear them begging for help, for someone to stop him. Ryan climbed back up, his movements mechanical as he called for backup. The man didn't resist when the officers arrived to take him into custody. He sat quietly in the back of the patrol car, staring out the window with an expression of hollow resignation. As the authorities began to excavate the area, Ryan stood beside the dog, his hand resting on its head. You knew, he murmured. You knew this wasn't just about Harold. The dog wagged its tail faintly, its eyes meeting Ryan's with a look of quiet understanding. But what secrets did Harold take to his grave? And how many more truths lie buried in the shadows? The investigation is far from over. The first light of dawn crept over the hills as the excavation site buzzed with activity. Officers, forensic experts, and reporters swarmed the once desolate area, piecing together the horrors that had lain hidden for years. Ryan watched from a distance, his thoughts heavy. The remains of 5 children had been recovered so far, each one identified by small, heartbreaking clues: a tattered shoe, a faded ribbon, a broken toy. Each discovery weighed heavily on his soul, but one thought gnawed at him more than anything: how had no one seen this? How had the world ignored the signs of such evil? Beside him, the dog sat quietly, its tail thumping softly against the ground. Its fur was matted with dirt, and its paws were scraped from its relentless digging, but its eyes shone with a calm determination. It had been the catalyst for everything, the unwavering force that refused to let the truth stay buried. Good boy, Ryan murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. It let out a soft huff, leaning into his touch. The arrested man, later identified as Harold's younger brother, Richard, had provided chilling testimony. He claimed he'd discovered Harold's crimes after finding evidence in the cabin years ago.
Overwhelmed by guilt and fear, Richard had tried to atone by burying the victims and preserving their memories in his own twisted way. But Harold's death wasn't enough to end the torment. Richard had spent years haunted by the cries of the children he couldn't save in time. When the dog began refusing to leave Harold's grave, it was as if the victims themselves had sent a message, demanding justice from beyond. Ryan looked toward the excavation team as they uncovered another small skeleton. His jaw tightened. "This isn't just about Harold or Richard," he said to his partner, Detective Morales. "This is about the community that let this happen. Someone had to have seen something, heard something. They just didn't care enough to act." Morales nodded solemnly. "Sometimes people don't want to believe monsters exist, especially when they wear the mask of someone they trust." Later that afternoon, the press conference was held. The police chief detailed the findings and announced plans to reopen all missing children's cases linked to Harold's timeline. The families of the victims, many of whom had long since given up hope, were promised closure. As the crowd dispersed, Ryan knelt beside the dog. "You did it," he said softly. "You brought them justice." The dog licked his hand, its tail wagging gently. It had been the silent hero of the story, guided by instincts no human could fully understand. In the weeks that followed, the small town underwent a transformation. The victims' graves were honored with proper ceremonies, their stories finally told. Harold's once celebrated reputation was torn apart as the truth of his heinous acts spread. But for Ryan, the case left a lingering scar. He found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the images of the tiny bones and the anguished cries of the victims' families. One evening, as he sat on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee, the dog padded up to him. It had become his unofficial partner, refusing to leave his side since that fateful night. "You're not just a dog, are you?" Ryan said with a faint smile. "You've got a gift, one that saved lives." The dog tilted its head, as if understanding. Months later, Ryan stood in front of a memorial erected in honor of the victims. Flowers and toys surrounded the engraved names, a testament to the innocence lost and the resilience of those who sought the truth. As he placed a small bouquet at the base of the memorial, the dog sat beside him, its gaze steady. "People will forget," Ryan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But not us. Not ever." The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a sense of peace that had long been absent from the town. As Ryan and the dog walked away, a faint ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the memorial. It was a sign, Ryan thought, that even in the darkest of places, light could find its way back. What do you think drove the dog to stay at the grave? Was it loyalty, intuition, or something even more extraordinary? Let us know in the comments below. And if you were moved by this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more mysteries that reveal the hidden truths of the world.